And this morning, I'm really excited to be hanging out with Geraldine Fraser-Moleketi. She is an anti-apartheid activist, a former minister, a former chair of the Thabo Mbeki Foundation. She's the chancellor of the Nelson Mandela University. She's the chairman of Tiger Brands. And that's just among other things. I was like, what do you not do? Where do you find time for all of these things? Thank you so much for making time for us.
Thank you. Good morning, Clement, and good morning to your listeners. Just one small amendment. I'm not former chair of Thabo Mbeki Board of Trustees. I'm the current chair.
You're the current chair?
That's right. I was the former chair of the Advisory Council of Mapungubwe Institute of Strategic Reflection.
Thank you so much for that correction. Where do you find time for all these things?
It's actually not as intense as some of my previous incarnations. And I must say that I also make time, and I consider this relatively sacrosanct, that on a Saturday I spend with my 2 grandchildren, unless there's something that cannot be postponed. So we structure time. We lead lives where we need to feed back, and we do so probably in different segments, but it all forms part of the whole.
I saw that you grew up reading banned books at a library. Did that get you into trouble at some point? And what kind of reading were you doing at that age?
Well, you see, I should start earlier, but let me go to that. There used to be an Isa bookshop in Observatory that I think in Cape Town. That's in a bit of trouble at the moment, financially and otherwise, called Open Books. And it was a place you could go to and access banned literature. And I was part of a reading circle in the 70s. It was a high school reading circle with a small group of us, and we used to read dialectical materialism. We read difficult books at that point, like the German ideology. I mean, obviously looked at works by Marx and others. And these were sourced from Open Books and then, of course, reproduced, Did it get me into trouble once? It was a very close call. And that was, interestingly, in 1976. But this was a combination because I was also part of, I was at a high school called Livingston High School. And this was a high school that was associated with teachers and a history of consciousness very differently. I mean, a number of the teachers were either banned, others left the country and all, and they always looked at, framing alternate education, so much as there were major objections to coloured education, Bantu education and all. Those teachers who remained at the school and in the system looked at going beyond the curriculum. And the South Peninsula Education Fellowship was a centre where we used to come together, there were talks and all. And during 76, we had one such talks, but at the same time, now let me explain, number of people, teachers at Livingston, were more identified with the Unity Movement and the Teachers League of South Africa. But some of us had already at that point looked towards the Congress movement, to the African National Congress that was banned then, South African Communist Party, and this is because of familial links. And at the time, there was the doc speech of Nelson Mandela that was banned, and we had copies made, and of course it was done on those old Roleo machines, I think that's what it was called. So there were a number of copies, and it was in my bag, having come from the SPEF meeting, and my parents picked me up. And we had stayed with my grandmother at the time in a little place called Klipfontein, which is where the now Crossroads informal settlement is. But before that settlement, there was this community that lived there. My father was a principal at a school in Fora, a school for children in need of care. But because the June 16 uprising from Soweto had spread across the country, it had spread to Cape Town, and he fetched us from the SPEF meeting because we had to drive past Guguletu and Langa and all.
Yeah.
And we got stopped at a roadblock, and
the
we
speech is
had
in your bag.
this. And it wasn't just one copy, it was many copies because we were distributing them. My parents didn't know we had it in the bag, and the policeman at the roadblock said to my father in Afrikaans, we're going to check the car, do you have anything? And he simply said, Meneer, sir, I've fetched my daughters from town and we're traveling together. So my sister and I were sweating, I can tell you, on the back seat. Fortunately, they didn't look at us, and let us pass at that point. And that was a close call.
That was close. But there was a time in Zimbabwe that you were arrested?
That's correct.
Okay. What was that for?
In Zimbabwe, the arrest was for 17 days in solitary confinement. And I must state that this was around the assassination of Comrade Joe Kabi that took place on the 31st of August, 1981. That assassination was carried out by a hit squad, that was led by someone called Gray Branfield. Gray Branfield, the reason that his identity is now known is because he was killed in Iraq on the 6th of April 2004. So it shows you dogs of war across. Gray Branfield was originally from part of the Rhodesian security forces that were recruited by the South African government. Comrade Joe was one of 50 ANC leaders that were put on the list at a very senior level by the then apartheid government as leaders they had to assassinate, eliminate. And the intention was that this would be opportunistic. But they then apparently changed this according to the materials that are available, where there had to be permission given for each of the assassination. So Comrade Joe was assassinated at the Ashdown Park house of the ANC. I was working closely with him, as were various other comrades. And myself and one other comrade found his body when we came back to the house.
This is
night.
Underground in Zimbabwe.
Yes, it was the ANC residence, but it was not an open residence. Yeah. And this residence was actually Comrade Joe was under surveillance from over a period of about 3 weeks. The exact dates are available for public record. And it was the second attempt to assassinate him in Zimbabwe. The first one was in February of that year, when 24th of February 1981, to be specific, where they placed a car bomb. They placed a bomb under the car he drove, and they had a matchbox device under the wheel that would detonate this bomb. Of course, it would have not just killed him, it would have also affected everyone else. So let me just conclude the background that I'm going into a bit long. There was a trained MK cadre at that point. I was untrained in terms of formal training. That came later. And he used to check the car every morning. So he went around the car and he noticed what looked like a Tupperware, a rectangular Tupperware under the body of the car. And Comrade Joe himself, they contacted the Zimbabwean authorities. There was a contact at that point in time.
Okay.
And it actually happened to be the incumbent president.
Robert?
Who was then, who was then the Minister of State Security. And they sent the detonation squad in February to defuse that. So that was the first time. The arrest happens because the narrative given, and it was carried in the Citizen immediately after the assassination. It must have been the first 3 days of August of 1981, where they said a faction in the ANC was responsible for the assassination of Joe Kabi and presented it as two factions. And they arrested myself on the 24th of August of 1981 from the ANC office.
Who was
in
driving that
Angwa
narrative?
Street.
Was it driven from within the ANC, or was it just a story made by the apartheid government?
It was the narrative driven by the apartheid government. And you can also see that materials and, some of the research that came out, even about the island, talks about, the Nelson Mandela group and the O.R. Tambo group. Unsurprising that we have the reality of counter-revolution in the ANC today, because it has continued. So I'm simply saying it's not a new narrative. But you see, they couldn't succeed to destroy the ANC from outside. It had to happen from within. But you asked me about the arrest, and I think I've given you a little bit of color around it.
I'm glad that you did. How was it in solitary confinement?
So on my arrest, I was taken to Chikarubi prison. And Chikarubi is a high security prison. Quite difficult associations with Chikarubi itself. And when taken there, I was allowed to have 2 books. I suppose the one I took was quite predictable, but I took 2 books with me. And whilst in that prison, interestingly, I felt safer whilst in Chikarubi than later when they moved me to the Harare Central Police Station. I didn't understand the move in the first instance, and it's only later when I was released that I realized what may have resulted in it. But because it was a period that fell over 2 weekends, I think it was 2 weekends, I think I felt quite insecure in terms of my person. Because if you're alone in a cell, and the reality, sadly, was some of the police on duty weren't exactly sober all the time. And I, who during the day, especially over the weekend, asked the women police officers who were in charge of the cells, because they would, pick people up for petty theft and shoplifting and all. I said, put women with me so that I was not alone. But nothing happened, but it was just this psychological fear that you could be subjected to personal abuse.
Which are the 2 books you took?
The one was ANC Today.
ANC Today?
Yes.
Okay, did you take any Marxist?
No, the ANC Today was actually a book that brought together different speeches, spoke about various seminal meetings of the ANC, but also spoke about the Wankie comrades. And a number of them were on death row in the former Rhodesia. And it was during that 17 days I was able to place the names of the Wankie comrades to those that were then released from prison in Zimbabwe, because people use pseudonyms. We all use pseudonyms depending on where we were.
So whenever I talk to anti-apartheid activists, I really love hearing such stories, because I think it makes me appreciate our democracy more. Every time I hear how this road has been paved for us, because I feel sometimes we take it for granted. I think the story of the difficulty during and at the height of apartheid by activists hasn't been fully told. And every time I hear it, it just reminds me of how I should not take our freedom and our democracy for granted. When you reflect back on that struggle and what you've had to go through, leave the country, Zimbabwe, the arrest, and you look at where things are now, what goes through your mind?
So two things, Clement. I mean, firstly, we were all determined to build a democracy, to build a non-racial, non-sexist society. And we did this premised on the values and vision of the Freedom Charter, and that was our commitment. We joined the ANC voluntarily, and at that point it wasn't about career politics. It was about commitment, whether it would cost your life or imprisonment, but to make a change. Would I have done things differently? No. There are sadly too many people who died, and the extrajudicial killings and all, that's something that I think has left quite a mark, on all of us. We can't pretend differently. With 1994, and this is both the negotiations going to 1994, the structures, both underground, the mass democratic movement, and everything that contributed towards our democracy and freedom was necessary. I think it was important. Yes, things have gone wrong, but I think we should also bear in mind that we've got a sound constitution, and a constitution, as you correctly pointed out, that we fought for. I think our challenge has been where we have allowed ourselves not to hold everyone accountable as we should. And I want to go back to the earlier example I made around an attempt to project factions in the ANC way back in 1980, 81, and even earlier. And what we've fallen into is a situation where we've actually allowed ourselves to become factionalized. And we've allowed those who may have infiltrated the movement and those who engineered it from outside to succeed to a degree. But we should also use this moment to turn things around, because we've got to, one, renew the movement, but above all, for the millions of South Africans, we must ensure that South Africa is a country where everyone is able to live into it. And we've got to build a strong economy. We've got to ensure that there is, personal security.
You were once the Deputy Minister of Welfare and Population Development. When I read that, I was like, population development? What was that about?
That was actually the mid-90s, it wasn't late. when we got into government, there was the Department of Welfare and Population Development. The focus was very much on population control in a narrow sense. And this had caused quite a resistance from a large section of the population because of the approach that was taken to that. And it was at that point where we developed a population policy that sort of linked it more to development and looked at what is required in order to ensure, firstly, that there's greater empowerment of people, the very clear understanding that when you look at the whole issue of population development, you also need to talk about women and their reproductive health, reproductive rights. How does this link into the National Development Plan? Because it shouldn't be seen as an add-on and all. But you would note that we subsequently changed that thrust and focus to one that was that of social development, where we need to look at how we are able to build and rebuild society, and within that deal with the realities of migration, population movements, the whole issue of resources available for people and not resources that's focused on a particular population group narrowly. So, I mean, it was what it was all about. So I wasn't only Deputy Minister, I became the Minister of Welfare and Population Development.
And then after 1999, that was the general elections, right?
That's
Thabo Mbeki
right.
then appoints you as the Minister of Public Service and Administration.
That's right.
I'm interested to hear, how difficult was that period when he resigned? Should I say when he was recalled by the ANC? Because so many of you decided, that's it. You drew the line and you say, I'm also walking away. But it's so difficult when you see an organization you've been part of and it's been your home, and you are literally not happy with what they've done, and you are now sort of like distancing yourself. How was that moment at the time? And was it distancing, or was it just taking a stand and saying, we're not going to be part of that?
So it was a bit more than we are not going to be a part of that. So, I mean, for those of us who were in cabinet and the executive at the time, we were very clear that if there was a decision to recall President Thabo Mbeki, and that decision was taken by the party, if you look at the Constitution, the president leads cabinet. And just constitutionally, it means that cabinet should be dissolved. Even if you would reconstitute a cabinet under a new president and appoint exactly the same people. So it's, as I mentioned to the then Secretary General of the ANC, I said it's not like lifting a sluice gate and saying the water continues running and you're lifting the sluice gate because the dam is overflowing. It's very different. And if there was any decision that was taken by the president, he never took the decision alone. It was taken in cabinet. And we took a stance, those of us who resigned, where we said that we clearly don't agree, but also constitutionally it's problematic. How do you stay on in that way without, the Constitution being followed around how it is put together?
But part of it was to send a strong message?
Sorry?
Do you not think part of it was also to send a strong message?
Of course it was to send a message, but it was not just sending a message willy-nilly. Look at all the people who resigned. It's people who have had a track record in the movement and a track record in government at the time. So I'm sure it wasn't easy for those who stayed on, but those who stepped out took a considered decision. And did so even though we weren't absolutely sure. We weren't sure what we were going to do thereafter. I mean, Jabu and I had kids at high school and a daughter at university at the time. So it wasn't just a personal decision. It was a larger, more political decision that says, this is not right. I was Minister of Public Service. As Minister of Public Service, the Constitution is very clear in Chapter 10 on what the public service is about, and also about the issue of accountability and governance. And how would I stand before public servants and say, well, I decided not to resign, even though the Constitution is clear that the President leads cabinet. I decided that I would continue and ignore that clause, but I expect you to comply and live up to the Constitution. I felt you don't do that. I mean, it's just not ethical.
And speaking of Bab Jabu, Zimande on the WhatsApp line says, hi Clement, please can you ask her also how and when and how old they were when she and Jabu met?
We met in Angola in 1982. I was 22, he was 25 at the time. But that's when we met the first time. We were living in an underground flat in Luanda, and we were en route to the USSR on specialized training.
Sure, at the age of 22 and 25.
That's correct, yeah.
That was so young. I mean, I'm trying to remember where I was at the age of 22 and 25, and like military training or specialized USSR training was probably going to be the last thing on my mind. But obviously the circumstances were different at the time
Very
and what was required. So that's when you met for the first time, and when was the decision made that, we love each other, we're going to do this life together?
That actually came in 1983, so it didn't take too long because we trained together and so on.
Nice. The next song that we're going to play, Abel will choose for us because you and I can't decide which one. But Abel, you choose between Nina and Tracy.
Gonna get easier. Ooh, child, things will get brighter. Ooh, child, things are gonna get easier. Ooh, child, things will get brighter. Someday we'll get it together and we'll get it undone. Someday when the world is much brighter. Rays of a beautiful sun. Someday when the world is much lighter. Ooh, child, things are gonna get easier. Ooh, child, things will get brighter. Ooh, child, things are gonna get easier. Ooh, child, things will get brighter. Someday together and we'll get it undone. Someday when the world is much brighter. Someday we'll walk together in a beautiful sun. Someday when the world is much lighter. Ooh, child, things are gonna get easier. Ooh, child, things will get brighter. Gonna get easier. Ooh, child, things will get brighter. Someday we'll get it together and we'll get it undone. Someday when the world is much brighter. Someday we'll walk together in a beautiful sun. Someday when the world is much lighter.
can never go wrong with Nina Simone, eh?
But you know, it's quite a special song, this one. And both Jabu and I love it very much. And it takes us back to the 80s, the 90s, and beyond. And he actually chose the song before he spoke at our daughter Tando's wedding, you know, during the ceremony, because it was also about our journey. We were quite committed that things would change. But you know, yesterday is another country.
Absolutely.
You know? Yeah.
I'm going to ask you to put on the headphones. I want to take this quick call from Beryl in Johannesburg. Beryl, good morning.
That I've always regretted in terms of my own career was actually leaving the Department of Public Service and Administration. Yes, so it's just great, absolutely wonderful to hear Minister's voice.
So you worked with her when she was still with the Public Works Department?
Public service.
Public service.
Public service.
Yeah.
Public service and administration. Hi, good morning, Minister. It's so good to hear your voice.
Good morning. It's good to hear you, Beryl. We need all public servants to put their shoulder to the wheel. It's now more than any other time that we need to show that this engine of government can work as it should. It's sort of gone into a little bit of reverse.
Yeah.
And we need accountability. We need Batupile to be a reality that each person feels and experiences.
Yeah. Well, Beryl, thank you so much for that wonderful call. I also got a message from Bazima Shilowa on Twitter who says, Clement, Geraldine is too modest, and rightfully so. But when she went to social welfare, Africans were excluded from child social grants. She changed all of that and created one that benefits all who were vulnerable. Geez, that must have been so much work to do. But did it take, I mean, we had political power, so intentionality was there. You've had the support of the president of cabinet. Was it tough getting this off the ground?
Yes, thanks, Mbazima. He's quite correct. We made that change, but it wasn't the individuals. There was leadership. We provided the leadership, but we worked with teams, and teams of people who were quite selfless. And I could call out some names, you know, Dr. Leila Patel. You can talk about people and social workers who came from the South African Black Social Workers Association. People came together because it was a commitment to turn things around. It wasn't easy to extend the grants because the communities that had access felt quite entitled, and you know, they had higher grants than others, and we had to look at how we spread the pie. So I'd always draw on, I'm not sure if it's a Tswana or Pedi proverb that says, you know, a mother shares the head of a locust amongst all children, because it's a Pedi, yes, because at the end of the day, we've had such inequality in South Africa. It hasn't changed, but this cash grant has alleviated the absolute poverty. But we need to do more, and hence my message earlier about getting the economy to grow. And it's the responsibility of government, the input of the private sector, and civil society to make a real difference.
Hey, Madimecha, please pass my regards to Sis Geraldine. Tell her it's her friend's daughter, Miranda's daughter.
Oh, wow.
Cookie, I just wanted to say what a ray of fresh air to hear her voice on the airwaves. And Nina Simone, we appreciate you. We appreciate you, Sis Geraldine.
That's beautiful.
You know, Clement Miranda was someone that worked inside the country in internal structures, was with me outside, returned, and she sadly died too young. So it's quite emotional. Cookie, I am in touch with your dad. I hope you're well. I see the photos. Thank you for that message.
Oh, that's beautiful. Siyabonga on the WhatsApp line says Clement, Mam Geraldine and her peers were the ANC we wish we still had. Listening to these stories, I'm of the same appreciation of our beautiful country and its constitution. Thank you for the years of service, Mama. I'm able to teach English to all South Africans because of your sacrifices. That's a message from Siyabonga there. I can't believe we're out of time already. My goodness. I could talk and listen to you. Thank you so much for making time for us. I know how busy you are.
Thank you.
And you know how difficult it's been to get you here. I've been trying, and I'm glad you finally agreed. We appreciate you, and we appreciate the sacrifices you've made for this country.
Thank you, Clement.
Thank you.
And now, as South Africans, we must pull together. This is our country, irrespective of where we're located. We've got to ensure that we push back hunger, poverty, unemployment.
Hanging out with Clement
on 702.
Let's walk the talk.